information.
Oh, got it. Okay, get rid of that. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We have a lot of material to cover today, so we're going to get right to it. First, I want to introduce you all to Meredith Ostreicher, who you all can see, and I think whom you all know. She's an administrative manager for the CTR, and she is going to work with us today in terms of monitoring questions. So we want this to be interactive. We encourage your feedback and your questions. We really want to hear from the navigators and from everybody here. So every 2 or 3 slides on a periodic basis, we'll stop and ask for questions, and Meredith will monitor and call on you so you have a chance to discuss and bring your question in. So we ask that you not use the chat box for questions. We ask that you use the raise hand function. She will be monitoring the raise hand function, and she will not forget you. You will get your chance. So you are encouraged to do that. And the second thing I want to say is that we are being recorded. So, and I believe the recording will be available on the website later on. But just please make sure not to disclose any protected health information when you speak. So let's start with acknowledgement of the different types of navigators that we have in the NNE CTR. We are aware that we have different types of navigators. Different navigators have different skill sets, and they live in different corps. So this is our understanding of it. We have our regular research navigators who live in the Bird Corps at Maine Health and live in the Professional Development Corps, and I think a couple in the Bird Corps as well at UVM. And these are the navigators who work with investigators on research design, conceptualization, human subjects issues, regulatory issues, the setting up of REDCap and such. They also connect investigators with other resources they may need, such as the community engagement navigators, honest brokers, statisticians, or data analysts. We also have data analysts who may or may not be actually also called navigators, but they do work with investigators who need data analytics needs, and they are mostly in the Bird Corps. And often the research navigators will put the investigator in touch with the data analysts as needed. And we have community engagement research navigators who work with communities and practices in rural and sometimes non-rural locations to help investigators develop and implement a research project at whatever stage they're at. And these navigators as well will consult with other navigators as needed. So, I mean, I think the basic thing is each navigators have different areas of expertise and work together to refer as needed. So we just wanted to present that. The first thing we really want to talk about is the timeline for the pilot project process. It mirrors a regular NIH R01 grant. From the time of application to the time of award is practically 1 year. And it goes through all the phases that a regular NIH grant would go through. And we have already kicked off round 8. We're coming up on round 8. The call for letters of intent was announced on June 30th. The letters of intent have come in. They came in on August 1st. And the pilot project leads, the pilot project core leads are in the process of reviewing the letters for eligibility and adherence to scientific criteria. And they, once they've gone through their review, the invitation to submit a full proposal will be going out on September 1st. So that's why this is a very timely session for all the navigators. Once the invitation to submit a full proposal goes out, they have 2 months, the months of September and the month of October, to develop and submit their proposal. There will be a webinar in the middle there somewhere where around September 29th, where we will answer any questions they have for applicants, and navigators will be invited. But that 2-month time frame, September 1st through November 1st, I think the navigators will be busy working with the applicants. So November 1st, the applications come in. November through January is a kind of sit, wait, and see. We always say that when we apply to NIH, because the reviews are being conducted. So there is nothing to do during that time. The reviews are conducted, and it is our goal that by February 15th, earlier in February if we can, the recommendations for funding will be announced. It is my understanding there will be probably 5 applications that can be funded, and those will go out on February 15th. That's the pre-award application phase. So February 15th starts what we call the JIT, or just-in-time phase. That's an NIH term that stands for, we're looking at you closely for funding, but we can't fund you until we have all this other stuff. So the just-in-time phase, we let them know they're recommended for funding, but they won't be funded until other stuff happens. 2 more levels of review. There's external advisory committee approval due, and there is NIGMS approval due. Nothing can start until those 2 approvals happen, and finally NIGMS is the absolute final approval. We cannot submit it to NIGMS for approval until we have all the regulatory approvals, mainly the IRB approvals. So on February 15th, they will receive a recommendation to fund letter that outlines what they need to do next. The request for regulatory approval and human subjects training certificates. This is where navigators will need to assist. A request for additional revisions for NIH compliance. That's where I do an administrative review and look at the proposal, and I can pinpoint things that will need to be changed so that it is compliant with NIH and what NIH is looking for. And we will ask for some revisions or additional information at that point. We'll ask for them to send us those documents by April 15th. We'll ask for external advisory committee approval by June 1st. This is something that doesn't involve the navigators at all. The CTRPIs, which Cliff Rosen and Gary Stein generally communicate with the external advisory committee. We'll send them a roster of who they recommend for funding. We'll send them information and summaries of the proposals. And most of the time we get approval without a problem from the EAC, although they certainly can ask questions. And then it is our hope, and we're going to talk about this more because we've had a lot of delays, but it is our hope that we will have the regulatory approvals by June 30th. You should all know that the grant year, the CTR grant year, has a start date of July 1st and an end date of June 30th. And then each July 1st, we get a new notice of award and we start a new year. So we need to fund all the pilots within the year we are planning to fund them, because that's the year the money is available. So that is another issue. The final phase here would be that we have the approvals and we send it to NIGMS for its final blessing. And we have to wait sometimes a couple of weeks, sometimes more than a couple of weeks, depending on what NIGMS comes up with. Sometimes they will approve right away if it's pretty simple, and sometimes they have questions. We respond to any questions or need for additional information. And once we have an email, and we get NIGMS approval via email, once we have an email, the project can start. And so we're hoping to have projects started by July 30th in the first month of the grant year. So those are the phases. That's what's coming up right now. And I think I will stop and see if there's any questions before I go on. Meredith, is there anything?
Wendy Craig has a question.
So I just want to, it's Wendy. I just want to clarify, Michelle, that gives 2 months for IRB approval.
More than that. Let me go back. Okay. So if we let them know that they're recommended for funding on February 15th, and we're hoping for regulatory approvals by June 30th, we're looking at 4.5 months.
Okay.
Now, hopefully, if it's exempt or something simple or expedited, and there's no, and people work quickly, it could happen sooner. But we actually have allowed 4.5 months in here.
Okay, that's great. Because
is that okay?
That's better than it was. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay.
This is Gary. Actually, the one thing I just wanted to mention to the UVM navigators is that Renee Stapleton, who is my partner for the administrative operation at UVM, she is now the chair of the IRB, and will work with people to go ahead and to provide guidance and how, and if something is going to go ahead and to be exempt or is going to have minimal review, she will give you directions on how to do it. And she welcomes doing it. This is not an obligation. This is not a problem at all.
That's great.
Right. Sarah Gabrielson has a question as well.
Hi, thanks. How much of the time do PIs actually seek IRB approval before even hearing back about funding? I mean, is that something that's somewhat common, or do you think it's a waste of time to encourage them to do something like that?
That is a fantastic question. I'm going to take a shot, but I ask other leadership here to weigh in. Generally, my experience, not just with pilots, but with all grant proposals, is it's not required. And most people, in my experience, do not apply to the IRB before they know they have funding. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. And also there's an issue of whether or not the IRB wants to be reviewing things before they're sure they're funded and going to go on. So most of the time they wait until they know they're going to have funding, although some projects that might be complicated or high risk maybe should be encouraged to apply early because they will take a longer time. But that's my experience, Sarah. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in on that question.
Michelle, I'll chime in. I think
Okay.
It depends is the question, which is not a great answer, but it depends on really what the trajectory of the project is. If the project's going to move forward, regardless of CTR funding or whatever funding they have, they're going to apply for something else, et cetera. I find that our investigators are actually interested in moving it forward because it does expedite that timeline when they do get their award. So it really does depend on what their trajectory is for whether they're going to move the project forward with other sources of funding. And that could be internal funding, that could be other awards.
Thanks.
The other thing I was going to say is, after the review, once we have identified the grants that are going to be recommended to be sent to our external advisory committee and sent to general medicine, you have a pretty darn good idea that it's going to be funded. And I would strongly encourage that these folks at that point go ahead and make sure it goes to the IRB or IACO, depending on if it's humans or animals.
Right.
Tom also has a question. Sorry, Sarah.
Oh, sorry. I had one more little question. And that was just about the IRB review, like at Maine Health. Is there priority for these projects, would you say, in people's experience?
Oh, I don't.
Let me answer that. I'm co-chair of the Maine
Tom
Health
will answer.
IRB.
Yep.
Not really. I mean, sometimes there is a little bit of priority given, but really our IRB is pretty flat out pretty much all of the time. So they're not keen on having, as Kim mentioned, projects. If projects are going to proceed anyway, then sure, submit it. But if it's not going to happen without the CTR money, they actually want to know that it's going to be funded. And I just wanted to make one other comment. I don't have a question. The business about, if it's simple approvals like expedited or exempt research can move the timeline forward, but it can't be any sooner than July 1st for funding, because that's, we're funding it with the next year's grant money. So July 1st is the absolute earliest that anything could be funded.
Correct. Yes. Was there anybody else? Okay. Yeah. The one thing I will say about the IRB, because we met with the IRB briefly, and Tom's right, they're flat out, but they do want to know, and we are in our new process is going to be informing them when there are recommendations for funding, so they know what's coming down the pike and they know what to expect, and they may be able to troubleshoot some things ahead of time. So the IRB will be part of the meetings that we set up with the leads that are recommended for funding early in the process. So they will have more awareness of this, Sarah, and I think that will help in moving it forward as well. Okay, so we're about to launch into the application part of round 8. I've already talked about the estimated start date there. So communications with navigators at the application time. I think this is a little bit of a change how we've done it before. We want to proactively let the navigation community, which would be the core leads of each of the cores that have navigators in the course, let them know who is being invited to submit a full proposal right away. So that means we're going to let them know in early September, as soon as we let the pilot investigators know, so that they can proactively designate a navigator to proactively reach out to the pilot leads who are preparing proposals to see right from the get-go what kind of help they might need, and so that it's not so much of a last-minute process. So that's one thing, a better communication with the navigator community. And then I do want to mention that we often have applications outside of Maine Health and UVM, such as, Dartmouth or UNE, UMaine, et cetera, and they do not have any in-house navigators. They do not have any CTR navigators. But we do have a requirement that if you're an outside institution, you have to have a collaborator either at Maine Health or UVM. So our thought was that we would assign a navigator to the outside institution based on who they were collaborating with. So if they're collaborating with Maine Health, they get a Maine Health navigator. So that was our thought there. So that's the communication, the navigators at application. So now we're into the application phase, and by no means do we think the navigators are going to work on every aspect of the proposal at all, but we thought it would be good to just sort of tell you what the major components of each proposal is. The first thing, though, I want to say is detailed instructions have been developed both for the regular pilot project and also for the human subject section, which I'll talk about a little bit. And they are all on the website. And we will also send to all the navigators copies of these instructions along with this slideshow after it's over. So you will have access to all of these instructions. But basically, the application is sort of a mini R01, if you will. It's got an NIH face page. It's got a project summary or abstract. It's got a list of senior key personnel. It's got a budget and a budget justification for each collaborating site that wants to receive funds. It has specific aims and research strategy, a little bit abbreviated. It's got a 6-page limit, bio sketches of the lead and the other senior keys, a human subjects section, which is fairly extensive if you're doing human subjects, and a vertebrate animal section is required if you're doing vertebrate animals. Those are the key big sections. Now, we are thinking that the navigators would really focus on helping the applicants with study design, human subject section, statistics, and really the science of it and the human subjects and the clinical aspects of it. We do not expect that the navigators will be working on the budget, but you should refer applicants to their institution's grants office or departmental budget administrator. That's how UVM does it, through departmental budget administrator. All of this is spelled out for the applicants on the instructions, but they might need to be told again that there is a place for them to go for the budget. And any general questions they have on anything, or you have on their behalf on proposal format, electronic submission, et cetera, the CTR administrators are your go-to people. That's Meredith or Sheila Clifford Bova at UVM.
Michelle, Sarah does have her hand up. I don't know, before we get into, I know it gets more detailed here, so maybe Sarah,
I know. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, thanks again. I have a question about the relative roles of the department-specific navigators and the NNE CTR navigators. You talked about the applicants being assigned an NNE CTR navigator, so I was just wondering what my role may be in the future.
Oh my gosh, Sarah, you are full of fantastic questions, and that one I absolutely cannot answer. I think we're going to have to table that one unless, Susan Santangelo wants to talk, or Rob, because we haven't talked about that one. We do have all the CTR navigators who are part of the CTR, and then we have departmental navigators. And the question is, if one of your PIs from your department needs help, would it be you or somebody from the CTR? I don't know if Melissa or Susan or Rob want to respond on that, or just get back to Sarah on that.
Yeah, we'll probably have to get back to Sarah. Maybe Susan might have some more insight in that.
I think it will depend on what kind of help is being asked for, but I think that the departmental navigators who meet regularly with the CTR navigators should be up on all of these processes and timelines, and will be the first line of help for their department PIs who have applied for CTR funding. And if they need further instruction or help, should just contact the core CTR navigators. That would be my recommendation at this point.
Does that help, Sarah?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I guess I'm just trying to figure out how my time would be allocated away from things I already do, but I do appreciate that it would be a relationship between the navigator in the department and the NNE CTR, and they'd have to figure out how to best help the applicant together, I imagine. That does help somewhat. I guess it's a little bit unclear still, but I'm okay with that.
Sarah, do you meet regularly with the CTR core navigators? Once a month?
We do, but we don't necessarily talk about individual projects like applicants like this. I think it would be a more of a one-on-one relationship. I don't know if other people have had experience on the call with that relationship, but it's not. Yeah. It's not quite.
I'm wondering if one of our new, as I mentioned, process is going to be when we invite people to submit, we're going to proactively send to the core leads the list of people invited to submit. And I mean, at that point, it could be that Susan or Wendy or somebody in the CTR department looks through it and notes whether or not any of those applicants have access to a departmental navigator, and maybe has that discussion back then, has a discussion and decides what will happen. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Sarah, are you at Maine Health or are you at UVM?
I'm at Maine Medical Center. I'm a pediatric navigator hired by the Department of Pediatrics.
Okay, thanks.
I think Wendy.
Yeah.
This is Wendy. I'm at Maine Health. I'm one of the sort of CTR navigators. Sarah, I think that really makes the best sense, is that when we get the list and we're assigned to the list, we just reach out and involve the departmental navigators all the way along. Definitely. Just as you and I have done for other projects,
Yeah, I agree. I think some of the specifics of this process may be more familiar to NNE CTR navigators, but the content maybe the navigator can help with. I'm sure there's a great collaboration that can make it work very well.
Yeah, I would say not necessarily to that, Sarah. I think it's a case-by-case basis. There's no one-size-fits-all project, as always. So,
yeah,
we should just plan on working together, I think, when needed.
We do work together.
Yeah.
And Sarah, I would say one more thing. Even though you're a department, there are departmental navigators who are not specifically on CTR projects, you're helping everybody in your department with all of these things, right? I just want to mention that all of the rules and regulations and how you put this together for the CTR pilots is all pretty much exactly the same as how you would do other NIH grants. It's really not different. So it would help you on all of the grants that you're helping your investigators with. Okay. Should we continue?
Great. That was a great point, Michelle. I like that.
Yeah. I mean, these are mini R01s. And so if you know how to do this, you can go on to the bigger stuff. I did want to actually, I'm just going to say this, put out a little bit of a plea to the navigators on the human subject section. I've been the person who has been reviewing and submitting these proposals to NIGMS since We started in 2017, and I can tell you that probably 90% of the comments and concerns that come back from NIGMS have to do with how we filled out the human subjects section. And I have just sort of, trial by fire or whatever, figured out some of what NIH is looking for, but I think it would be really a great idea. It would be so helpful if navigators really looked at there's detailed instructions we put together for the human subject section. There's an NIH Word template that Meredith put together that mirrors exactly what NIH wants. Meredith actually has to put it into an online form when we submit for approval. The human subject section has grown. It has become quite extensive, and not only that, but the program officials at NIH are looking at it really, really closely. So we have to, it's actually probably longer than the 6-page research strategy, to believe it or not. So I want to ask the navigators, if you're working with somebody on an application, to really look closely at the human subject section. I'm available. You could email me if you have questions, but I wanted to just maybe throw out a few points to look at for the human subject section. So the first question they ask is, if you're not doing human subjects, are you using human specimens? And if you're using human specimens, there is a chance that you are not considered human subjects if you're doing secondary research and there is no way you can know the identity of the participants. But you have to justify it. You have to explain it. NIH requires that. So that's a part that you want to look at and make sure that's answered correctly. Then they want to know if it's exempt and under which exemption. Now, we are going to be talking a little bit later about IRB and exemption categories, so I won't go into it now, except to say at the application stage, it's important to try to figure out if you're exempt and to get your exemption number right. And the reason I say that is because depending on which exemption it is, will tell you which parts of human subjects, the human section, you need to fill out. And the best way to figure out which exemption you are is to go to the IRB and have them do a determination early on in the process. I think they can do that pretty quickly. I know Maine Health, you have to fill out a form, and I'm not sure if at UVM you can do a determination thing on your own, right? Kim, you can actually figure it out by answering questions.
Yeah, there's a self-determination tool.
Right. So it might be a little bit easier at UVM, but that really helps you. We need to get that right. If it's not gotten right, the whole thing needs to be changed before NIGMS will approve it. Then there's a section called a clinical trial questionnaire, and there are 4 questions you need to answer. And if you answer all of them yes, it has to do with interventions, etc. If you answer all of them yes, you are considered an NIH clinical trial, which means you have to fill out even more of the human sections form. It's quite extensive and it's quite detailed. And then there are a lot of requirements around monitoring clinical trials. So getting all of that right is important. The NIH requires a single IRB if you're doing a multi-site project, which means you are running the same protocol at more than one site or more than one institution, and it's not exempt. You will have to figure out, the applicant needs to figure out with their collaborator who will be the IRB of record and has to write that down. There's an inclusion enrollment table, a planned enrollment table that has to break out by gender, race, and ethnicity, how many people they plan to enroll and how that breaks out. And oftentimes PIs need help with how to fill that out. I often have sent them to the Maine and Vermont census to figure out, the number of minorities in our states, which is unfortunately not that many, but that needs to be filled out. And then there are questions on risks and protection from risks and inclusion of women, minorities, and data safety. And it's fairly extensive and it's become very important to NIH. So that is the one thing I wanted to sort of focus on with navigators. And I'll stop there.
We do have a couple of questions.
Yep.
Wendy and then Gary and Janet.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, Wendy, I'm wondering if we're getting into a bit of a catch-22 here with the IRB, because, I know our IRB doesn't like to work on a project until it's funded, yet all of this is happening pre-submission.
Yeah. Okay. The only thing, so let me respond this way. We're not saying people should apply to the IRB before they know they're funded. I agree with you, Wendy, on that. I was saying that it would be important to know if it's exempt.
But that's
you think that
would
is
be
just
an application. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
certainly a research determination would be considered an application.
Right. I don't know what the answer to that is, because if they get the exempt, if they think they're exempt and they write they're exempt, and if they got it wrong, or if it was a different exemption, or if it wasn't exempt, they need to redo the whole thing. So there is another good question that's coming out of this. I mean, it's something we can go to Melissa, do you have any ideas about going to the IRB and asking how we could get an exemption determination quickly at an application stage? Is that a possibility for Maine Health?
So we can certainly talk to them. What I've done in the past in these types of situations, I'm fairly comfortable with the exempt categories and where a project proposal might fit. There have been occasions where it might be a little bit tricky, and I have on a case-by-case gone to the IRB folks to talk through it with them to get a better idea of what category they would put it in. But I think, the categories are pretty specific, and I think it's feasible to identify it in advance, as long as the proposal is written well enough.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really the issue, isn't it, Melissa? If you've got it, it's really hard to do any of this until the proposal is in very, very final form.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds good. I mean, if somebody like you, Melissa, and Wendy could, make an educated guess without involving the IRB, we also could go ask the IRB what they don't like. They don't like people making their own determinations without going to the IRB. So that therein lies the catch-22, Wendy. Right? So
but we'll be including them moving forward. So I think it'll be a much smoother process where we have the collaborative effort now. Okay.
Yes, we are. So that'll be good.
I do think that's an important question to ask them, though.
Okay. IRB exemption in advance. Okay.
And the research determination. Do they want an upfront research determination as well? Because that's sort of what's mentioned here. Is it not human subjects research or not?
Right. We don't have a huge number of those, but yeah, that's exactly right. A research determination would be a good thing in cases where it fit the bill, where they're using specimens, that are not identified. If they're using specimens, say, from the biobank, my understanding is it's not human subjects research. So, but we'll follow up with the IRB on all of that. We'll follow up on all of this. We're making notes. I think Meredith, Gary and Janet have.
Yes. Yeah.
Just three things I wanted to mention. At UVM, if it is from the biobank, it would end up not having to go through the IRB because they have a protocol approved, etc. The second thing is at UVM, you can feel totally comfortable contacting the IRB and they will tell you if it's exempt. Okay. So that can be extremely helpful. And third, the question of whether it's a clinical trial or not. And the most direct way to answer that is on the NIH site. They have 3 criteria that will go ahead. And if you answer no to all 3, it's not a clinical trial. Right. It's just any one of them. It is a clinical trial, and it's very user-friendly.
Yeah. I think that the clinical trials are, they might be the most straightforward of all of them. But yeah, so we will follow up on all of these really great questions with our IRB. It sounds like the UVM IRB can easily make those determinations, but we'll follow up with Maine Health. And any other questions on human subjects or comments? Okay. Again, the navigators are not responsible to do budgets at all, but I thought it might be good to know what the basics of the budgets are. And also just to mention, although the navigators do not do budgets, I could certainly see that they could advise on issues such as, you know, how much effort the applicant might need from, say, a research coordinator or a research assistant in order to, you know, based on the scope of the project, or where to go to get clinical costs such as CPT codes. You know, just or how much is, you know, a reasonable amount to pay a patient incentive or that sort of thing. But in terms of actually doing the budget, no, that would go to the budget person. Personnel, only employees of the institution should be listed. And you should all know this is not NIH, but this is a CTR requirement. CTR does not pay faculty salaries. So basically, pilot leads do not get salary support on these grants. The salaries go to research coordinators, research assistants, data analysts, those sorts of people that are needed to operate the project. If there's more than one site, and many of our projects are multi-site, each site needs to do a separate budget with its own fringe and indirects, and approved by their own budget person. Consultants cannot be an employee and cannot be a student. Clinical procedures, if it's a main investigator, they should contact the clinical trials office to get the codes and the amounts it costs, say for a blood draw or an x-ray or whatever. And at UVM, it's the Office of Clinical Trials Research. Patient incentives is very common in these budgets to sort of boost enrollment. CTR only allows $3,000 for equipment. CTR does not allow travel to conferences to make presentations, but it does allow travel to different sites to carry out the project. And I've already mentioned that faculty cannot be compensated, and no foreign involvement allowed on a CTR grant. So for main applicants, navigators can send them right to research accounting, one person, Elena Odlin. If Elena's not available, go to Meredith and she'll tell you what to do, right, Meredith? And for UVM, they need to see their department budget administrator, and Kim can help direct them, or Sheila can help direct them. Applicants from other institutions need to work directly with their own grants office. Like any grant, we can't really help another institution with their budget. Okay, all right, that's the end of talking about the whole application. Obviously, we didn't cover everything, but happy to take questions and comments about the application process and the role of the navigator. Anything there? Okay. We're going to move into the JIT, the just-in-time phase. So this assumes we have told people that they're recommended for funding, and they have gotten their letter and they know what their next steps are. So the navigators at this point will become reactivated. One or more navigators will be assigned to each pilot recommended for funding. The navigator will assist with required documents for regulatory submission. We're going to have meetings with the pilot investigators, the PPP leadership, the CTR administration, and the IRB will be invited as well, especially if it's a sort of complicated or a multi-site project. So we will have more proactive communication to get the regulatory stuff going. And there might be other non-regulatory things that the navigator can assist with. There were two things I wanted to put here that it's important for navigators to know. IRB protocols and approval letters must have the same title as the pilot project title, and the pilot investigator as the PI. So when we get an IRB approval, it has to, and it's Dr. Jones, it's got to say Dr. Jones on the approval, and the title should be the same title as the pilot project. Now, it's not the end of the world if that doesn't happen, if it turns out to be an amendment on somebody else's, but we would need a letter from the IRB confirming that this particular approval does cover all the work in the pilot, because NIGMS will not accept it otherwise. So that's an important thing to let the applicants know. And the next one doesn't have anything to do with regulatory, but it's really important, we have just learned. Please let the applicants know, once they get this recommendation letter, they cannot start spending any money. There is no pre-spending of funds until NIGMS approves the project. It is not funded until NIGMS approves it. And I'm putting that there in Rob asked me to put that in bold because we have had some issues with that lately. So no one should assume they are funded just because they have a recommendation letter. So that's the
We do have a couple questions here, Michelle.
Okay.
Wendy first, and then Melissa has her hand up.
These may or may not be the same question, actually. I think that comment, that the point about the matching names and project titles, project titles very easy, but when we have an external investigator who's partnering with someone at Maine Health, it's the Maine Health co-investigator who has to submit to the IRB. So we will run into that mismatch.
Yeah. That is great, Wendy. Thank you. And you reminded me of something I should have realized. We did just have that. You and I are talking about the same one. And I had to write to NIGMS and explain why the name of the PI of the pilot project was not the name on the IRB approval. And I explained because she was not an employee at Maine Health, and it was accepted. So I had a reason and they accepted that reason. So you're absolutely right. That was kind of a one-off, but that was a really good point. And Melissa?
Hi, thanks. So yes, we did have that issue, and that was addressed within the approval and the key personnel, Wendy. We identified the investigator from the other site as being the site lead. So the name was included in documentation. It just needed to be sent. My question or comment is, we say that there's no pre-spending of funds until the NIGMS approval. So in terms of sequence of events, we really need the IRB approval before we get the NIGMS approval, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's why we're waiting for the IRB approval before we can even submit to NIGMS. That's correct.
Correct. Yeah. So they would not have the award in advance. But also, this was another problem with one of the investigators, that there should be no pre-spending of funds, but also there really probably shouldn't be any work on the project until they receive all the necessary approvals. And you would think you wouldn't need to state that quite so explicitly, but I think we do, because we've experienced it.
That's right. And I think Wendy's hand is up again.
Yeah, this was a question for Melissa. So will the IRB modify their approval letters to include the name of the external PI then?
So, I think there's room for discussion with them about these types of issues moving forward. Again, we were able to address this pretty readily with the information that we had at hand. If NIH had come back and given pushback about that particular project, they might have had to revise the letter, but it worked out in this case that they did not. So I think we just need to be very thoughtful about making sure that the names are included appropriately and that the grant awardee, if not a Maine Health PI, is notated in the documentation.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. At this point, I want to just, we have collected some, just some examples of problems that have come up because, as I said before, the regulatory approvals have taken way, way longer than we ever expected, and we're trying to figure out why, and we're trying to address these issues. So just from talking to a couple of navigators, a sampling of issues, the IRB delays, here's why, some reasons. IRB application itself was not submitted in a timely manner, or a navigator was not included early enough to help move it along. The investigator misunderstood the requirements. The submission was incomplete or needed more details. The IRB has a high volume of work, nothing we can do about that. Applicants don't follow up on IRB questions in a timely manner. And then issues we found at the application stage, that the navigators have limited ability to assist applicants outside Maine Health and UVM. Applicants expect navigators to help with the budget, or navigators are even asked to write whole sections of the proposal, which of course they should not have to do. And then just before I open it up, because really we want to hear from you guys other things that might have happened. We have some case studies. Just let me tell you, we're currently in year 7 we've opened up year 8 now, right? That's open, but we have not funded almost all of the pilots that were recommended for funding in year 7 because they've all had delays, all of them. And here's why. So here's the first case, external institution PI. There were reliance issues. It was a non-traditional pilot because it had started some work in another institution and it had genome-wide data issues. So it was a very complicated project. Case number 2, it was an exempt category, but it needed a reliance agreement. It was an outside institution, and the PI had difficulty finding a collaborator who had the time to and interest to collaborate at Maine Health. And that happened even after it was recommended for funding. Case 3, the IRB application was submitted very late, and we didn't know about it, and the navigator didn't know. We just didn't know that months had gone by with no application submitted. Case 4, the pilot PI was actually unclear that they needed IRB approval. They had duplicative funding, and the PI had limited availability to even supervise the project. This one, ultimately, the CTR pulled this one. They decided not to fund it. Case 5, multi-site study waiting on reliance agreement from outside institution. And case number 6, pilot PI had personal issues and took time off, which is fine. We all do that, but didn't inform anybody. So it was just sort of sitting there for months. So we are still frustrated, but we're excited that we have some new processes to put in place to hopefully deal with these things. But I really want to open it up now to hear from navigators on any comments about these or other types of issues that they may have dealt with that we don't know about. No, I thought we'd have more. No? Well, okay then.
Well, Wendy has her hand up.
All right, Wendy.
Sorry. No, I just want to emphasize the complexity of working with investigators from the outside and trying to marshal them through the Maine Health IRB regulatory process, which is incredibly unfamiliar to them. And also it's really hard for us to advise them on logistics when they're coming from elsewhere, because we don't know the logistics of their institution.
Right.
I just want to emphasize how difficult that is for us. And I'm sure
Yeah.
Melissa can add to that as well.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes the Maine Health IRB can seed review if all of the work is being done at another institution. And we certainly have had that with most of the UVM ones. There were a couple of other UNE ones that I think the UNE IRB submitted. But I think in this particular case, they were dealing with Maine Health patients as well, maybe, I think, which is why I can't really remember. Okay. And any other comments before we move this along? No other issues. Okay. So new process is being put in place for the upcoming round 8. This is what we've worked on based on the experience and the frustrations we've had. So navigators will be informed immediately when a project is recommended for funding. The PPP leads, Rob and Janet, will work with the navigator supervisors and core leads to identify appropriate navigators for the regulatory approval JIT stage. This may or may not be the same navigator they worked with on the application. I mean, maybe they work with a CEO navigator, but now they really need a regulatory specialist. I'm not sure, but they will work on who is the appropriate person to help lead this. Meetings will be set up immediately. We had not had this before with the pilot PI recommended for funding, navigator, pilot project lead, IRB representative, and go over the regulatory approval process and set the benchmarks and the deadlines, and have communication all along the way, including communication with navigators. And we ask navigators to let the PPP leads know and the CTR administrators know if they're running into problems or non-responsiveness or anything like that. So that we hope that putting these processes in place will help move it along. Because after talking to a lot of people, it became clear that 4.5 months should, for the most part, be enough time to get your regulatory approval. Number 5, in some cases, if things don't go according to plan, or if people are not responsive or whatever, I mean, the funding may have to be forfeited. But those are the new processes that Rob and Janet have put into place after we all talked about it. Any comments or questions about that? All right, well then, I am now going to turn this over because we're going to do a quick overview of IRB process and levels of review. And I think Melissa Graham is going to start us out, Melissa, and you just tell me when to advance the slides, okay?
Hi, thanks, Michelle. And thank you. These new processes are actually really exciting. So I'm really excited about the plan moving forward. So just a quick overview of the IRB processes and levels of review. There's really 4 categories of review. There's the research determination, and the determination is about, are we conducting human subjects research for which the IRB has oversight or not? And a quick definition, research is defined as being a systematic investigation designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. And the human subjects piece is really about a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research obtains information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual and uses, studies, or analyzes that information or biospecimens. And even more so if it involves a living individual who the investigator obtains, uses, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information from biospecimens. So in this slide, Michelle, you had included that if human specimens or data are being utilized, but not human subjects research, and the example given was really if samples are being obtained from the biobank in a de-identified manner, that's one of the ways that you can practice research but have it not be human subjects research. The way to do this is by submitting a research, at least at Maine Health, we submit a research determination form along with an overview document, and it usually takes within a week to 2 to receive that determination letter. There's an exempt category, an expedited category, and exempt and expedited are really considered minimal risk categories. Exempt is a little bit different. Exempt, people have confused exempt to mean that it doesn't require IRB review. That's not exactly right. It just means it's exempt from certain regulatory requirements, things like written informed consent. You still need consent, but not necessarily written informed consent. And then the full board review is kind of the holy grail of the larger interventional and greater than minimal risk studies.
Ready to advance?
Please. So the exemptions, all exempt protocols have to be submitted for IRB review, and they're reviewed on a rolling basis. I think, in terms of the IRB, if they know that there's a just-in-time submission, they actually, if schedules and circumstances allow, they will try and prioritize. They don't like to promise that. That can't always happen, but they will try if there is flexibility to do so. Exempt determinations are granted for protocols that fall into very specific federally recognized categories, and that's covered on the next slide. And then the exempt determination timeframe, again, it really depends on what the initial write-up looks like to get something from a concept that's down on paper down to a place where the IRB can really digest and review the project. Usually it can probably 2, maybe 3 months. And then so the bullet here says that NIGMS requires the IRB determination letter specify the exempt category. That is standard at Maine Health. We always do that. And next slide, please. So there are 8 exempt categories listed here. Category 7 and 8 are really about broad consent, and we don't do that here. And Kim, I don't think you do them either at You don't do broad consent at UVM, is that correct? Okay. So the ones that we see an awful lot of are exempt category 2, where we have surveys and interviews and those kinds of things. Category 3 with benign behavioral interventions in adults. Exempt category 4, which is secondary research. There is a smattering of the others, but those 3 are really the primary that we see a lot of.
Next slide.
Please. And then limited review. That limited review really kind of came out with the 2018 regulations. And, you know, I can go over a lot of detail, but basically it's really about when you have information that is recorded with identifiers. And so the IRB reviewers will conduct what they call a limited review just to manage and look at the sensitivity of the data and make sure that appropriate protections are in place.
Okay.
And then, you know, this is again more information about the limited review categories under the exempt categories. I think it's useful to have to reference, but again, it goes back to recording data with identifiers.
Are we good?
We're good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to turn this over now to Kim from UVM, the Professional Development Core lead, who's going to talk about expedited and full review.
Thanks, Michelle. Expedited review projects. So these are studies that fall into a category where they involve only minimal risk, and they fit into the federally specified category that can be reviewed and maybe actually expedited reviews. Examples for these minimal risk studies tend to be things like blood collection studies where we're collecting blood samples, so low risk activity, or non-invasive collection of biospecimens. They can involve research with materials, so data, documents, records, or specimens that have been collected or will be collected solely for the purpose of research. It could also be collection of data from voice, video, digital, or imaging recordings made for research purposes. And then research on individual or group characteristics or behavior. And that could be including but not limited to research or perception, cognition, motivation, identity, language communication, cultural beliefs, or practices. If a study seems to present only minimal risk but doesn't fit the expedited category, then a full IRB review must review the research and may determine that it can undergo expedited review moving forward. I think the takeaway from that is that ultimately the IRB has the final decision about the type of review, expedited versus full review. And we've had that situation here at UVM where someone will submit a protocol for expedited review, but the committee takes a look at it and says this actually needs to go to full review for whatever reason, or characteristics of the participant population, or logistics of a procedure that's being done, that type of thing. Go ahead, Michelle, please.
I went. That's the next one. Yeah.
Yep, got it. Thanks. There's a delay on my end, so.
Oh.
Additional types of applications that also qualify for expedited review could be modifications to a study that involve no more than minimal risk. And a good example of that would be key personnel changes, or perhaps a change that is changing procedures where a higher risk procedure is being removed. So it's not like we're adding risk, we're actually reducing the risk. So those types of things can be expedited by our IRB. When the IRB reviews and approves research without conditions at a convened meeting without requiring further review at a subsequent convened meeting is what expedited review is. And then there's also the secondary research under exemption for III involving identifiable information as regulated by HIPAA. You can go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah.
Sorry, again, probably a delay.
Yeah, that's okay.
Conversely, full board review. So all studies that don't fit into the exempt or expedited categories must go to full board review. And these are generally greater than minimal risk projects. Maine Health, the full board meets the last Tuesday of the month, except during December. And Maine Health requires that all PI initiated and greater than minimal risk studies be reviewed at a scientific review committee prior to being reviewed by the IRB. At UVM, the IRB Committee on Research for Medical Science meets the third Wednesday of every month. Our deadline for submission is a month prior or 4 weeks prior to that. And the Committee on Research in Behavioral and Social Sciences meets the second Tuesday of the month. And we also have scientific review for specific areas. Cancer research goes to the Cancer Scientific Review Committee, for example. You can go ahead. This was mentioned a little bit earlier in this presentation, but when we have multi-site protocols, and this is again where we have the exact same non-exempt protocol being conducted at more than one institution, the federal regulations require that studies that are multi-site, domestic, and federally funded must have one IRB act as the IRB of record. And I'll talk in a second about single IRB, but basically this is where we have the lead site for a project be the IRB of record, and the other organizations in the collaboration are ceding their review to the IRB of record. Single IRB, while not an IRB at all, is actually a group of organizations, academic organizations, and Maine and UVM and Dartmouth are all part of this group that have agreed on reliance terms in the contract. So there's no working out the reliance agreement terms, which can take a long time if you're part of the single IRB group. We've already agreed on terms for relying on another IRB, and we use that portal, if you will, to communicate to the IRB of record that we would like to cede our review, or we can request that review be ceded. So in the situation where UVM is the lead project, UVM will be the IRB of record for the project. We reach out to Maine Health's IRB to let them know that we would like them to rely on us. And so there's a portal that we all work through and communicate through for single IRB members. Other local IRBs must cede review to the local IRB of record. And like I said, generally the lead site's IRB will be the IRB of record. And we submit the application through the Smart IRB process. We submit to our local IRB requesting to cede review to the lead IRB. So if, again, an example, it's a UVM lead project, the investigator at Maine would put in a request to the Maine IRB to cede review to UVM. It's all very clear, right?
Yeah.
Yep, the Maine Health IRB reliance teams were ready to answer questions and help on multi-site protocols. And we've listed the points of contact at both UVM and Maine Health for guidance on how to go through the cede review process. Timeline. So exempt and expedited studies are reviewed in the order in which they're received on a rolling basis. There's no deadline for submission of those studies. And once the complete submission is made, approval can take up to 4 weeks, but if IRB requests additional information, it can take longer than that. Full board studies must meet the submission deadline for the conveyed monthly meetings at both Maine Health and UVM. And at Maine Health, the investigators should allow time for scientific review as needed. And full approval may not happen at the first IRB meeting, and you can expect a few months to address all the questions and concerns, so a 3 to 6 month timeline. And then the multi-site studies can also take several months, as these involve multiple IRBs. And I think I'm handing it back to you, Michelle.
Yeah, any questions on the IRB section from people, or how this affects our timeline? You can see 4.5 months should, for the most part, we should get approval of our projects in 4.5 months, unless there's a really complicated high risk one, right, that has to go to scientific review, or, that involves many sites. The multi-sites can take a while. But yeah. Okay. So I'm realizing that it is after 4, so I will try to hurry through. The last part is just to go over the roles of the various players, and Meredith's going to send out after this, I think, a sheet with everybody's names who's involved in the pilot project process with our emails. But the pilot project program leads, the core leads, really run this program. That's Rob Koza at Maine Health and Janet Stein at UVM, and they are new. They are new in the renewal, and it's really great to have them because they're implementing the new proactive processes, which I think will help. So their job, they are right now reviewing the letters of intent for eligibility and scientific criteria. They are overseeing the entire review process, assembling the appropriate reviewers, managing the review process. They will oversee the JIT process, communicate with pilot investigators and navigators, set the deadlines for approvals, and work with the pilot leads and the investigators as problems occur. They'll troubleshoot those problems. They'll provide mentorship resources if needed. They will meet with the pilot PIs once the pilot is funded to review the expectations. They'll regularly communicate with the active pilots and consult with CTR PIs to address any major issues that come up with pilot progress or NIH compliance issues and things of that nature. The administrative managers, Meredith is here. Sheila is the UVM administrative manager, and these are the go-to people for everybody here, plus for any applicants. They can serve as the first point of contact. They answer all kinds of questions, and if they can't answer them, they will triage those questions to the appropriate people to answer them, and they will collect the information needed for our annual reports on the pilots. The Maine Health Research Grants Office, that's me. I'm a member of that, and I work solely on the CTR now. But we are the ones who deal directly with NIGMS as the signing officials for the institution that receives the funding. So we review and submit human subject section. We review and submit the pilot application. We respond to NIGMS questions. We develop and execute the subawards. Lisa Zaytunian is here, I believe. She does the subawards. So if UVM is awarded a pilot, it'll take a few weeks, but Lisa will get that subaward to you. We will, Tony Molina, as part of this office, helps pilot leads manage their spending, and the similar support is supplied at UVM. Our research accounting office pays the invoices from the outside institutions. We will amend the subawards if extensions are granted, and we can answer questions on whether a cost is allowable or a rebudgeting request is allowable. So we're the sort of the NIH people for you all. And we've already gone through the roles of the navigator in preparing the proposal, the JIT phase, and post-award. Well, we didn't talk about post-award, but navigators who had developed a relationship at the proposal stage may stay with the project investigator through post-award for periodic check-ins and assistance. So once is it, oh, sorry, Sarah's got her hand up, right? Meredith? I don't see Meredith. Sarah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I guess I had a question when you mentioned I think an extension in the last slide.
Yeah.
Can you explain like what the policies are around that? Because it seemed like in the case of a reliance agreement, it may take longer than 4 months and things may be delayed. So what happens in that case?
Yeah, so this is the really nuts and bolts about NIH funding, but I will share it all with you. So as I said before, the grant year runs July 1st through June 30th, okay? And then we have to wait and get a new notice of award. We expect that we will always get it because they will like our progress report. But oftentimes, especially because the IRB is delayed and therefore the approval of the project is delayed, oftentimes these projects do not get funding and do not get off the ground until halfway through the year, and sometimes almost all the way through the year. Okay, so what happens is they get 12 months, but if they're funded in March, right? If they're approved in March and the grant year ends June 30th, they've only had March, April, they've only had 4 months. So then we have to issue them an extension for the additional 8 months. We wait for a new notice of award and we issue the extension. That ensures that everybody gets a full 12 months. And NIGMS has been really good about approving these extensions because they agree that every pilot needs 12 months. Now, beyond 12 months, there's no guarantee. We have had pilots say they've had delays and they need another year, et cetera, and those have sometimes been approved, but NIH is getting a little more strict about approving additional extensions, and they require really good justifications. They require EAC approval and a whole process of approvals from the leadership of the CTR to the EAC to the NIGMS. So beyond the 12 months, it's not impossible, but it's a process of asking for it. But 12 months is pretty much guaranteed. Does that answer your question? Sarah?
Yeah, very
Yeah.
clearly. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. All right. So real quickly, once the project is approved, everybody wants to know when they're getting funded. They're finally able to get funded for, it's very simple at Maine Health because we hold the money here. So we set up an account and they can get going. If it's outside of Maine Health, if it's UVM, we have to issue a subaward. They still can get going on the day that they're approved. You know, if they're approved on May 15th, they can start on May 15th. They won't have their subaward for a few weeks because it takes some time, but they can bill us from the day they're approved, May 15th. So that will happen as soon as possible. The PPP core leads will meet with them and go over the requirements. There will be post-award check-ins, including navigation. We will let navigation know every time a pilot is activated so that the appropriate navigator who's working with that PI will know that it's activated and on the ground, and they can check in as they wish. The PPP core leads and the assigned navigators will coordinate so that the check-ins are efficient and not duplicative. I just wanted to mention publications. We're not really talking about this here, but any scientist who has funding from NIH, if they publish and NIH supported that research, they have to be compliant with the public access policy. It's another compliance issue. And that means they have to have a PMC ID number and they have to be accessible in that public database. It's another whole thing. It could be another whole training. I just wanted to mention it's a requirement. Pilots generally won't publish until after the pilots are over, but it is something that the CTR administration needs to keep in mind. And again, if it's a clinical trial, when the PPP leads meet with them, they will go over the specific requirements and duties of a PI who's a PI of a clinical trial. So I think that's all we have. It's 4:15, so we have time for questions if you have any, or follow-ups. I know we'll be sending out this slideshow, Meredith, right? And as well as the instructions and a list of the key people and their emails. But I do see some hands up now. I guess I can see them as well as you, Meredith. So Wendy?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of talk a little about navigation assistance when a project is ongoing.
Right.
We don't typically get involved in anything like, you know, data collection or anything. When it's only really when people run into trouble that they reach out to us. We're not study staff, right? We're not on the study as part of the team. Correct. So I just want to make sure the expectation doesn't get into that, but is more about problems that come up and helping them triage to get assistance with those problems.
I think that it is, but I would look to you know, Melissa and Kim, what your thoughts were, and Rob and Janet as well. But I think that's what the thought was, Wendy. Anybody want to take that one?
Yeah, I agree, Wendy. And I think when we talked about it, or at least when I had spoken about it in prior meetings, we are not considered part of this study team at all. I think one of the issues, though, is sometimes the team is not always timely about identifying issues. And so, yes, our job is to identify issues and help streamline those. And a lot of them actually happen to end up being regulatory related, whether it's a protocol deviation or amendments if they're needed and those kinds of things. So, but there are other reasons why it would be helpful to be involved in check-ins. And, you know, the couple of projects that I worked on through the CTR this year, each one has required some ongoing involvement outside of what we would consider normal. So does that answer your question?
Oh yes, Melissa. Yeah, I understand all of that. It's just I wanted to sort of get it out clearly to the group in terms of what Navigator typically does. And part of the issue is, of course, even if we check in, if they don't give us the information, we're only as good as the information we're provided. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. That's so right. Jennifer?
Hi there, I'm Jen from UVM. I just wanted to, I think it was said that the navigators would be notified as soon as the decision was made about whether someone could submit their full application. But I just want to be sure it's very clear that we know whether the investigator has been made aware or not, because the timing was really close on one of them, and we just need to know that the investigator's been notified before we reach out. That timing got a little blurred once.
Oh my God, that's not good. My understanding, but Meredith and others can chime in here. My understanding is that the letters will go out to the investigators first that they're recommended for funding, and right after that we would reach out to the navigators. Is that Kim and Rob, Janet, anybody is that how you see it too?
I would say that makes total sense. I mean,
yeah,
at least give it maybe a day leeway or 2 days, and then send the other letters out so everybody's notified. But I mean, just can't promise that someone actually sees the letter. I mean, or their email, so that can happen too. So yeah.
Gary and Janet?
Just 2 quick things. One is that for people who are funded by the NNA-CTR or the pilot project, please, when your presentations, even if they are informal presentations, internal or external, use slides that go ahead and designate the NNA-CTR on it. It's really important for the program to have that type of recognition. When a grant is funded, like the parent CTR grant, we're concerned about credentialing it for renewal. So that's really key. The second thing is that the research that's being pursued is NIH-funded research. Consequently, there are NIH requirements for data sharing that we need to go in and be compliant with. And that is becoming more and more demanded and monitored.
That's a really good point, Gary. I've seen the new requirements for data sharing on R01s and such. I have not seen that now come out yet in the list of what's required of pilot project applications. They have not come out yet and said that we have to have that section in the pilot. So I wouldn't be surprised if that comes out next year or something.
I would do it preemptively because it's the way that it was crafted at NIH. It was for NIH-funded investigation. So have confidence that that's going to be one additional hurdle we'll have to jump over.
Okay, well, I think we're done, unless anybody has any questions or comments at this point.
Thank you very much. This was very informative.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming and listening. And if anybody has anything, you can reach out to Meredith and Michelle, myself, Janet. There's a whole bunch of us that could field your questions.
Yeah, and we want to hear from the navigators. I think Kim and I were talking about this. If navigators or a particular subgroup of navigators want or feel they need some more training or more in-depth training on particular issues, maybe IRB, IRB process or different types of approvals or things like that, do let us know, because more specific. This was more of an overview of the process and all the things that come up with the pilot. So be prepared for September 1st, the first week of September, when I think people will be invited to submit and the work will start. But thank you all for coming.